The wind swept low and restless across the prairie, bending the tall grass into waves that shimmered gold beneath the late autumn sun. Clara McAllister stood on the porch of her weathered ranch house, her hands clenched around the railing as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. Behind her the house groaned in the wind, shutters rattling, boards sighing, like an old soul too tired to carry its weight. It had been 6 months since John's death. 6 long months since she had ridden into town in her black dress, leading her husband's horse with the empty saddle while neighbors whispered behind gloved hands. Shot dead, they said, ambushed by men who wanted the ranch, or perhaps by his own foolish dealings. Nobody knew for sure. Clara had buried him on the hill overlooking the pastures, a spot he'd once promised would be theirs to rest together, in old age. She had spoken no words that day, her voice caught like a thorn in her throat. Grief had hollowed her, but harder still was the silence that followed. The ranch, once alive with cattle, workers, and laughter, had thinned into emptiness. The hired men left when pay dried up. The cattle grew lean and wolves prowled the edges of her land. Now it was only Clara and the barren wind. Her fingers ached from mending fences and hauling water. The soil cracked beneath her boots, the sky wide and merciless. She was 27 and already carried herself with the weariness of someone twice her age. But she could not let go. This ranch was all John had left her, and pride or maybe stubbornness kept her rooted here. That morning, as Clara poured weak coffee into a chipped cup, she had seen the rider, a lone figure on a dark horse moving slow down the trail that wound between cottonwoods. He was broad-shouldered, his hat pulled low, a rifle across his back. She had felt her chest tighten, not fear exactly, but a warning. Strangers rarely meant peace out here. Now, as she stood on the porch, the rider drew near, dust curling from the horse's hooves. He halted at the gate, dismounted with a practiced grace, and touched his hat. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and steady. "Name's James." She said nothing. Her eyes searched him, noting the lines on his face, the scar along his jaw, the look in his eyes, hard, watchful, as if he had known too many battles. He continued, "I'm looking for work. Heard you might be needing a hand." Her throat tightened. Indeed, she needed help, desperately. But a man like this, a stranger with shadows in his gaze, every instinct told her to send him away. And yet, she thought of the broken fences, the dwindling cattle, the long nights when wolves howled, and she gripped the shotgun with trembling hands. She swallowed. "This is my ranch," she said finally, her voice steady despite her heart's quickened. "B.E. if you work, you'll work hard, and I don't tolerate liars." He nodded once, solemn. "Fair enough." Clara stepped aside, letting the silence hang between them. The wind rattled the porch as he led his horse to the barn. She watched him go, a strange unease settling over her. Something in him was dangerous. Yes, but something in her, buried deep beneath grief, had stirred at his presence. That night, Clara sat by the dim glow of the lantern, writing in her ledger. The numbers were bleak, debts rising, cattle dwindling. James was out in the bunkhouse, or so she assumed. She pressed the pen to paper, but her hand shook. She did not know if she had hired salvation or doom. Above the prairie, the moon climbed high, silvering the land with cold light. Somewhere beyond the horizon, men whispered in saloons of outlaws and lost fortunes, of killings done in the dust. Clara did not know yet that her new ranch hand carried such whispers like shadows clinging to his boots. For now, she only knew the loneliness of a widow, the desperation of a woman with too much land and too little hope, and the strange, dangerous comfort of a stranger at her gate. The first light of dawn spilled across the prairie in soft streaks of rose and gold, brushing the land awake. Clara rose early, as she always did, pulling on her boots while the air still held the sharp edge of the night's chill. The ranch had its demands, no matter her grief or exhaustion. Cows did not wait for morning, fences did not mend themselves. When she stepped outside, she caught sight of him. James was already at work, sleeves rolled high, shouldering posts as though they weighed nothing. His horse, a coal dark gelding, was tied by the corral, stamping its hooves impatiently. The man moved with a quiet efficiency, every motion measured, deliberate, as though he'd done this work all his life, or another life that looked close enough to it. Clara stood a moment on the porch watching him. Something about the way he bent to the task, like he belonged nowhere but in the labor, stirred something unsettled in her. He was no green hand, that much was plain. But there was something else in the set of his jaw, in the careful sweep of his eyes when he thought no one was watching. Wariness. A man who had learned to expect danger even in peace. When he straightened and noticed her, he tipped his hat. "Morning, ma'am. Fix that east fence. Wolves won't trouble it tonight." Clara nodded, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "You didn't have to start before sunup." His mouth curved, not quite a smile. "I like the quiet. Hours. Work's easier when the world's still." She did not reply but turned toward the barn. There were chores enough to keep her busy, and she would not linger in his gaze longer than necessary. Yet as she went about feeding the chickens and milking the cows, her mind betrayed her, circling back to him again and again. By midday, James had repaired the corral, cleared debris from the pasture, and even stacked a pile of split logs by the side of the house. Clara watched from the kitchen window, her hands stilled on the dough she had been kneading. He worked like a man carrying something heavy on his back, though she could not see it. That evening after supper, Clara sat on the porch steps with her ledger. James leaned against the post nearby, oiling his saddle. The silence stretched, filled only by the distant cry of a coyote and the steady rasp of his cloth over leather. Finally she spoke, her voice low. "What brought you here, James? There are easier places than a failing ranch to earn your keep." He paused a moment, eyes still on his work. "I've done my share of drifting. Figured it was time to stop for a while. Land like this." He glanced out over the fields where the moonlight softened the worn fences and empty pasture. "It deserves a fighting chance." Clara studied him, searching for truth in his words. They carried a weight, as though meant to soothe, but there was more he wasn't saying. Something he held back, tucked deep behind those storm-gray eyes. "You're not the only one who thinks this land deserves better," she said at last, her tone clipped. She closed the ledger and rose. "But I don't abide dishonesty. If there's trouble following you, best you leave now." For the first time his gaze met hers fully, steady as stone. "If trouble comes, it won't come because of me. And if it does..." His hand brushed the rifle by his side almost unconsciously. "You'll be glad I'm here." Clara's breath caught, not from fear, but from something harder to name. She turned quickly, retreating into the house, leaving him to the night air. That night, as she lay in bed, she stared at the cracked ceiling beams and listened to the soft creaks of the house settling. Somewhere beyond the walls, James slept, in the bunkhouse. She told herself he was nothing more than a ranch hand, a hired man to keep the place afloat. Yet she could not still the questions tumbling through her thoughts. Who was he really? A drifter seeking honest work, or something darker, something bound to the whispers she had heard in town about outlaws roaming the territory? Sleep came, late, uneasy, and restless. The following days blurred into rhythm. James worked tirelessly, repairing the well, cutting firewood, even tending to sick calves with a surprising gentleness. Clara found herself relying on him more than she wished to admit. Where before the ranch had felt like a burden pressing her into the dust, now it stirred with life again, though not without the weight of suspicion. One afternoon, as Clara rode into town for supplies, she overheard two men at the mercantile murmuring by the counter. "They say one of the McGraw gang slipped the noose, heading south under a false name. Dangerous kind. Shot a rancher near the creek last spring. Widows still trying to keep the land." Clara froze, her breath catching sharp in her chest. Shot a rancher. Her mind raced. John had been killed by a bullet near the creek. Her pulse hammered as she paid for her supplies and left. The ride home stretched long and heavy, the prairie pressing in around her. She thought of James's scar, the guarded look in his eyes, his skill with the rifle, Could it be? Had she brought her husband's killer under her own roof? When she reached the ranch, James was by the barn, shoveling feed for the horses. He looked up, tipping his hat with that same quiet steadiness. Clara's stomach twisted. She managed a nod, her face a mask, but inside, questions roared like a storm. If James was indeed the man who had taken her husband's life, what then? She owed John her loyalty, her memory, and yet, her heart betrayed her, softening with each passing day at the way James shouldered burdens without complaint, the way he moved through the land as though it belonged to him. The prairie sun dipped, low, staining the sky with crimson and violet. Clara stood on the porch, her hands gripping the railing, just as she had the day James first rode in. Only now, the silence between them carried a dangerous weight, of secrets, of suspicion, and of a love she feared was already taking root, whether she willed it or not. Winter crept early across the plains that year, arriving on winds sharp enough to strip the warmth from a body in minutes. The land, already worn thin by drought, seemed to groan under the weight of the season. Grass turned brittle, the soil cracked deeper, and cattle ribs showed through their hides. Clara McAllister felt it all, the heaviness of the weather, the debt on the ranch, and the constant nagging fear that she was not enough to hold it together. Each day began before dawn. When frost still silvered the earth, Clara would light the stove, her hands stiff with cold, and brew coffee strong enough to wake a corpse. James was always there, already moving about the yard, his breath clouding in the chill as he saddled horses or hauled hay. He worked like a man chased by ghosts, never pausing, never asking for more than what the ranch could spare. Clara found herself torn. On one hand, she could not deny his usefulness. Repairs that had lingered undone since John's death were now complete, and the barn stood straighter, fences sturdier, and the cattle, thin though they were, fared better under his watchful eye. But on the other hand, the whispers she had overheard in town gnawed at her. The McGraw gang. A rancher shot near the creek, a widow left behind. Each night, as she sat by the fire with the ledger balanced on her lap, she wondered. Was the man mending her fences the same one who had left her husband cold in the dust? The thought pressed against her like a stone on her chest. Still, when she looked out the window and saw him moving in the moonlight, checking the corrals with a rifle, slung easy over his shoulder, she felt safer. Safer than she had since John's death. It was a cruel contradiction, but one she could not shake. The ranch, however, gave her little time for reflection. Trouble pressed in from all sides. First came the cattle losses. A harsh windstorm rattled through the valley, scattering the herd and breaking more fence than Clara thought possible in one night. She and James spent long hours in the saddle, rounding up strays, driving them back through sleet that cut like knives. James never complained, though Clara could see the fatigue etched in his face. Then came the neighbors. Men like Clyde Hendricks, who had been circling her land like vultures since John's death, began stopping by under the guise of offering help. They sat on her porch with their hats in their hands, speaking in oily tones about how a woman had no business keeping a ranch afloat alone. "Sell now, Clara," Clyde had urged one afternoon, his eyes darting to the fields as though he already owned them. "This place ain't fit for you. Winter'll take what's left. Best cut your losses before it does." Clara had forced a polite smile, though her stomach burned with anger. "The ranch isn't for sale, Clyde." When he had gone, James stepped out from the barn, his jaw tight. "Buzzards," he muttered. "Circlin', waitin' for you to fall." Clara studied him then, the way his hand brushed the butt of his pistol as though instinctively. "They'll keep coming," she said softly. His eyes met hers. "Then we'll keep sending 'em away." She wanted to believe him. She wanted to lean on his strength. But the ledger's grim lines reminded her, nightly, that no matter how much James fixed or how many wolves he scared from the pastures, the numbers did not add up. Debts loomed and the bank's patience was thinning. One evening, after a long day of chasing cattle through sleet, Clara sat at the kitchen table, her head resting in her hands. James came in, the smell of smoke and leather clinging to him. He stood in the doorway a moment, silent, before finally saying, "You're carrying too much, Clara." She lifted her head, eyes rimmed red from exhaustion. "What choice do I have? This ranch was John's dream. It's all I have left of him." Something flickered across James's face, something like pain. He stepped forward, resting his hands on the back of the chair opposite her. Sometimes holding on can kill faster than letting go. Her chest tightened. She wanted to snap at him, to tell him he knew nothing of what she carried. But the truth of his words cut too close. And worse, part of her feared he was right. That night, as she lay in bed staring at the rafters, she thought of her husband. John had been a proud man, quick to laugh, quick to temper. He had built the ranch with his own hands, but he had also made enemies, striking deals that left Clara uneasy. He had never told her everything. There had been nights when he returned home late, his clothes smelling of whiskey and smoke, his eyes shadowed with something he would not name. Clara squeezed, her eyes shut. She did not want to doubt him, not even now. But doubt had a way of creeping in like the winter cold, seeping through cracks no matter how tightly the shutters were drawn. And always, at the edges of her thoughts, was James. The scar on his jaw. The way he watched the horizon like a man, expecting trouble. The way the neighbors quieted when he walked into town beside her. Some looked at him with suspicion, others with fear. One night, as a storm thundered across the prairie, Clara rose from bed and went to the window. Lightning split the sky, illuminating James as he walked the fence line, rifle in hand, his silhouette stark against the flashing heavens. For a moment, her breath caught, not in fear but in something far more dangerous. It was then she realized the cruelest truth of all. Whether he was her salvation or her ruin, James had already become the center of her thoughts. And she, a widow, still clinging to her husband's memory, was falling into the dangerous gravity of a stranger whose past could destroy her. The wind had carried the smell of wood smoke into town that day, mingling with the grit of the street and the restless creak of swinging doors. Clara McAllister hadn't planned to linger long, only to fetch supplies, settle her account at the mercantile, and return to the ranch before dusk. But necessity often held its own plans. The general store was busier than usual, filled with men in heavy coats shaking the cold from their boots. Grain sacks lined the wall, shelves half empty from the hard season. Clara kept her chin high as she made her purchases, conscious of eyes following her. The widow McAllister was always a topic in town. Her stubbornness in holding the ranch, her refusal to sell to men like Clyde Hendricks, her decision to keep a drifter on as ranch hand. When she stepped back into the brittle air, her hands stiff, around the sack of flour, she caught the low hum of voices drifting from the saloon across the way. It wasn't unusual. Men spent half their lives jawing at tables stained with whiskey. But something in the pitch of it made her pause. A name she thought she heard, carried faint on the air. McGraw. Her steps faltered. She shouldn't. Go closer. A decent woman had no business in a saloon. Yet her feet betrayed her, carrying her to the wooden awning, where the half-opened window spilled shadows and smoke. Inside, the piano clattered a lazy tune. Laughter rose and fell, and boots shuffled across the worn floorboards. But it was the voices in the corner, low and sharp, that rooted Clara to the spot. Heard tell he's riding under a false name. Slipped the hangman's rope in Dodge. Which one? The scarred one. James Carver, or James something he calls himself now. Her blood ran cold. James. The voices went on, a murmur she struggled to catch, but certain words sliced through clear as a knife. Widow's ranch. I shot the husband, some say. Fool woman don't even know. Clara's hands trembled, the flour sack threatening to spill. She forced herself to step back from the window, the boards creaking under her boots. No one noticed her. Slipped into the alley, but her heart pounded as though she had run 10 miles. The ride home was a blur of frozen air and biting wind. The prairie stretched endless before her. Yet for the first time it felt smaller, more suffocating, as though every blade of grass whispered the same terrible suspicion. James might be the man who killed John. By the time she reached the ranch, dusk had bled across the sky, staining it with violet and fire. James was in the yard, splitting logs, his coat thrown aside despite the cold. He looked up when she rode in, his scar catching the last light of the sun. "Everything all right?" he asked, his voice easy, but her ears betrayed her, hearing, menace in what might have been nothing more than concern. Clara forced a nod. "Fine," she said too quickly, dismounting before he could study her face too closely. She carried the flower inside, her back stiff, her breath shallow. But all through supper, as the stew bubbled between them and the fire cracked in the hearth, Clara's mind churned. Each flicker of his eyes, each shift of his hands seemed heavy, with unspoken truth. Had those very hands drawn the gun that ended John's life? Yet, when their eyes met across the lamplight, something else stirred in her. Not only fear, but the same dangerous warmth that had been growing since the day he rode up to her gate. It was this duality that tormented her most, that she could suspect him of murder, even as her heart betrayed her with longing. Later that night, after James retired to the bunkhouse, Clara sat alone by the dying fire. Shadows stretched long across the floor, the ticking of the old clock loud in the silence. She thought of John, his laughter, his temper, the secrets he had carried. She thought of James, the scar, the steady hands, the way the men in town spoke his name with both fear and respect. The weight of it pressed down on her chest until she could scarcely breathe. For the first time, Clara admitted to herself that she stood at a precipice. If James truly was the man who had robbed her of her husband, then every hour she kept him here was a betrayal of John's memory. The day broke sharp and dry, the kind of air that steals the moisture from your skin before you've even stepped out the door. Clara rose with a heaviness in her chest, her sleep restless from the whispers that still haunted her. The rumors, in the saloon, the name McGraw echoing like a curse. She tried to shake it off, busying herself with chores. But there was a tension in the air that morning, an odd silence over the land. The prairie birds were absent, the wind still, as though the earth itself was holding its breath. By noon, James had ridden out to check the south pasture, leaving Clara alone with her thoughts. She mended a torn hem at the table, though her hands worked clumsily. She couldn't stop seeing him in her mind's eye, the scar along his jaw, the way his gaze lingered on her sometimes, steady and unreadable. Was he protector or predator? The question gnawed at her. Then, as the sun dipped toward its cruelest height, she smelled it. Smoke. Clara shot to her feet, heart pounding. She ran to the porch and saw it, a dark line smudging the horizon, thick plumes rolling upward, carried, fast on a sudden wind. A prairie fire. Fear clutched her throat. She knew the danger too well, how quickly fire could leap across the dry grass, devouring everything in its path. The ranch, the cattle, even her own life. It could all be gone, in an hour. She grabbed buckets, racing to the well, her fingers raw against the rope as she hauled water. But when she looked up, the flames were already closer, their orange tongues licking skyward, the wind pushing them hard toward her land. Then James appeared, riding hard, his horse lathered with sweat. He swung down before the porch, eyes blazing. "Clara, get the cattle moving now, drive 'em toward the creek, I'll hold the line here." She froze, clutching the bucket. "You'll be caught in it. Do as I say." His voice cut through the roar of the wind and rising crackle of flame. Clara's heart pounded, but she obeyed, racing for the barn. She swung up into the saddle, driving the cattle with frantic shouts, her throat scorched from smoke. They bellowed, in panic, hooves thundering as they stampeded toward the low ground. Behind her, James fought the fire with a ferocity that seemed almost unnatural. He dug a line with the plow, beating back sparks with wet sacks, his shirt soaked through with sweat and water. When the wind shifted, flames surged dangerously close, but he didn't falter. He moved like a man who had danced with fire before, who had lived too long in danger to fear it now. Hours blurred into a haze of smoke and sweat, the sky a choking gray. Clara's lungs burned, her arms ached, but she drove the last of the cattle to the creek and turned back. terror gripping her at the thought of James swallowed by the inferno. When she reached the yard, her vision stung and blurred. She saw him, blackened with soot, his face streaked, hair damp, but standing. The flames had been pushed back, the worst of it diverted. The ranch still stood. Clara stumbled from her horse, collapsing to her knees. The world spun around her, the roar of the fire receding into silence. James was suddenly there, steadying, his hands firm but gentle on her shoulders. "You're all right," he murmured, though his own breath came ragged. "It's over." She looked up at him, eyes brimming with tears she hadn't meant to shed. The fire had stolen her strength, stripped away her defenses. In that moment, all she could see was the man who had stood between her and ruin, who had fought with everything he had to keep her world intact. And yet, as his gaze held hers, she felt the old fear rise alongside the gratitude. How had he known? What to do so quickly? How had he moved with such certainty, as though fire was an enemy he had battled before? The rumors clawed back at her mind. Outlaw, murderer, a man with too many shadows. But the warmth of his hands on her shoulders, the fierce steadiness in his eyes, made it almost impossible to believe. That night, after they had doused the last embers and tended the shaken cattle, Clara sat alone on the porch, staring into the dark. Her body ached, her lungs still raw from smoke, but her thoughts churned louder than the crackle of dying fire. James moved about the yard, checking for sparks, tireless even after the ordeal. In the moonlight, he looked less like a ranch hand, and more like some figure carved from stone, scarred, weathered, unyielding. Clara's heart twisted. She owed him her life, her land, everything she still had. But the question remained sharper than ever. Had she bound herself to her savior, or her husband's killer? The night after the fire was too still. Clara could not sleep, though exhaustion weighed her bones. Every creak of the house set her nerves jangling. Every sigh of the wind through the eaves sounded like whispers. The ranch had survived, but inside her the storm only grew fiercer. She had seen James stand against the flames like a man possessed, fearless, almost reckless, as though fire was an enemy he had known all his life. He had saved her ranch, perhaps even her life, but how could the same man wear the shadow of murder? By midnight she gave up on sleep, slipping from her bed to pace the parlor. The fire in the hearth had died to embers, casting long, wavering shadows. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and tried to steady her thoughts, but they circled endlessly. James's scar, his wary silences, the whispers in town. McGraw. Restless, she stepped outside. The night was cold. The prairie stretched, endless beneath a silver moon. She half expected to see James asleep in the bunkhouse, but a faint glow leaked from under the door. Curiosity pulled at her. She crossed the yard, each step measured, her breath shallow. She told herself she only wanted reassurance, that he was resting, that her suspicions were only ghosts conjured by tiredness. But when she pressed her hand to the rough wood of the door and eased it open, what she saw stole the breath from her chest. James sat at the narrow table, shirt discarded, the lamplight laying bare the broad planes of his back. His skin was laced with scars, not just the single mark along his jaw, but dozens. Bullet grazes, knife wounds, the map of a life lived in violence. He leaned over something on the table, turning it in his hands. Clara's heart stopped. It was a revolver, polished, well-kept. But more than that, the handle bore an engraving, crude but distinct. An M carved deep into the wood. She knew it at once. John had spoken of it, the mark of the McGraw gang, outlaws who had terrorized Dodge and Abilene. Men whispered their name in saloons, half in awe, half in fear. And now that mark gleamed in James's hand, her breath caught. The floorboard creaked beneath her, and James's head snapped up. For a moment their eyes locked, hers wide with horror, his narrowing with something unreadable. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice low, carefully even. Clara couldn't speak. Her throat was too tight, her heart hammering too loud. She turned and fled, the night air cold as knives on her skin. Back inside the house, she leaned against the door, trembling. She wanted to believe she had imagined it, that fatigue had twisted her sight. But the truth was too clear. James wasn't just a drifter. He was tied to the very gang rumored to have killed her husband. And worse, he knew that she knew. The Yuan. Hours dragged until dawn, each tick of the clock like a drumbeat in her chest. When the gray light of morning crept into the room, Clara felt hollow, her decision no closer than before. Could she confront him? Could she demand the truth? When James came up from the yard later, his shirt clean, his face freshly washed, he carried himself as though nothing had changed. He greeted her with a nod, asked after her sleep, poured himself coffee. The casualness of it unsettled her more than anger might have, but when his eyes met hers across the table, there was something different there, a sharpness, a weight, as though the game between them had shifted, and both of them knew it. Clara managed a brittle smile, but inside terror clawed at her. The ranch that had always been her sanctuary now felt like a cage. That night, as she sat alone by the fire once more, she thought of John. She thought of his laughter, his flaws, his sudden violent end, and she thought of James, with his scar and his secrets, his hands that had both saved her and now threatened to ruin her. One truth pressed upon her with crushing certainty. She could no longer ignore the danger. Whatever his role in John's death, James Carver, if that was even his real name, was a man with blood in his past, and blood always demanded reckoning. The morning sun rose hard and clear, burning away the last traces of smoke from the prairie fire. Yet for Clara, no light could pierce the shadows gnawing at her heart. The image of that revolver, with its crude M carved into the handle, haunted her waking hours. She tried to keep herself steady through routine. She milked the cow, mended a broken fence, and even forced herself to laugh lightly at one of James's remarks when they crossed paths near the barn. But each time his eyes lingered, on her she wondered, was it affection or suspicion? Did he know she had seen too much? By mid-afternoon, the question became moot. The first sound was distant, hooves, faint but sure. Clara straightened on the porch, shading her eyes. The horizon shimmered with heat, and soon, dark shapes appeared. Riders. 3 of them. Her stomach dropped. James emerged from the barn, a pitchfork in hand. He too heard the approach. But where her body stiffened with dread, his went unnaturally still. Every muscle coiled as if bracing for a blow. The riders drew near, their horses lathered, dust rising behind them. They didn't slow until they were nearly at the yard. Clara counted them properly now. 3 hard men, dust-stained and worn, their eyes sharp beneath the brims of their hats. The tallest swung down first. His voice was gravel. "Well, if it ain't Calder," he drawled, lips twisting into a smirk. Clara's blood went cold. Calder, not James. James didn't flinch, though a muscle ticked along his jaw. "You boys are a long way from Abilene," the second rider laughed. "And you're a long way from keeping your head down. What's the matter, Calder? Tired of running or just tired of pretending?" Clara's world tilted. Calder, outlaw. The whispers hadn't lied. She was living under her roof with the very man her husband might have died by. The third rider finally spoke, his voice oily. "Word is, you've been playing ranch hand. Here, serving coffee and fixing fences for a widow." He tipped his hat toward Clara, his eyes crawling over her in a way that made her skin prickle. Pretty thing, too. Mighty generous of her, taking in a stray dog like you. Clara's hand tightened on the porch railing, her knuckles white. James Calder stepped forward, placing himself between her and the men. His voice was low, dangerous. "Leave her out of this." The tall one laughed, a sound like splintering. "Wood. Always did have a soft streak. Ain't that what got you in trouble last time? Tell me, Calder, does she even know the truth about you? Does she know you put a bullet in her husband?" The words hit like a blow. Clara gasped, the air tearing from her lungs. She had suspected, feared, but to hear it spoken aloud, Her knees nearly gave beneath her. James, no, Calder, turned sharply. His eyes locked on hers, a storm of denial and anguish there. Clara. But the men were already mounting again, smirks carved on their faces. "We'll be back," the leader called, "and when we do, we'll see just how loyal you really are." They rode off, leaving a trail of dust and a silence heavy as death. Clara's whole body trembled. She wanted to scream, to demand the truth, to run far and fast from the man standing before her. But her voice failed her, caught in her throat. Calder moved toward her, hands outstretched as though to steady her. "Clara, listen to me." She backed away, her eyes wide with fury and betrayal. Don't you come near me." The look on his face was raw, pained, but she couldn't let it sway her. The name, the gun, the scars, all of it had converged into one brutal truth. The stranger she had let into her home was no savior. He was the past she thought buried, returned in flesh and blood, and she didn't yet know if she would survive him. The dust of the riders still lingered in the air long after they had gone, settling over the yard like a curse. Clara stood rooted on the porch, heart hammering, unable to move, unable to breathe. She had known deep down that the stranger who had wandered into her life carried shadows, but to hear them call him Calder, to hear them accuse him of killing John, it ripped something inside her clean open. James, no, Calder, stood before her, hands half raised as though reaching for her, but stopped by the fury and fear burning in her eyes. His mouth opened, closed again, his chest rising with sharp, restless breaths. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The silence stretched taut as barbed wire between them. Finally Clara found her voice. It came raw, trembling, but sharp, as glass. "Is it true?" she demanded. "Were you part of them? Were you one of McGraw's men?" Calder's jaw tightened. He looked away, toward the horizon, then back at her. His eyes were weary, shadowed. Yes. The word fell heavy, final. Clara staggered back as though struck. She had braced herself for denial, for excuses, but not for the blunt weight of truth. Her voice cracked. "And my husband? Did you—" She choked on the rest, unable to shape it. Pain flickered across Calder's face, and he stepped forward, desperation in his tone. "Clara, listen to me. I didn't kill John, I swear to God I didn't. But I was there." Her breath caught. Her hands gripped the railing behind her as the world seemed to sway. Calder raked a hand through his hair, his composure fracturing. "Years back I fell in with the McGraw gang. I was young, stupid, running from a life that had no place for me. They gave me a name, a gun, and told me I belonged. And for a while I believed them." Clara's stomach churned. She could see it, the violence etched into his scars, the weight he carried in silence. "But I wasn't like them," Calder pressed on. "I wasn't born for blood. I did my part, rode with them, stood watch, pulled a trigger once or twice, but every time it ate at me. And then came the night your husband crossed our path." Her breath seized. It wasn't meant to happen, Calder said hoarsely. "The gang was moving cattle through a canyon near Abilene. Your husband, John, he came upon us by chance. He recognized McGraw, drew his weapon before I could stop him. Shots were fired. God, Clara, it was chaos. McGraw himself pulled the trigger that cut him down. Not me. Not me." His voice broke. Clara clutched the railing until her knuckles whitened. She wanted to scream that he was lying, that he was twisting truth to save himself. But the raw anguish in his voice, the way his hands trembled, made her hesitate. Calder stepped closer, pleading. "I couldn't stop it, but I swear I tried. After it happened, I knew I couldn't ride with them any longer. I left that night with nothing but the clothes on my back and the scars you've seen. Ever since I've been running, not from lawmen, but from the man I was when I wore that name." Tears blurred Clara's vision, hot and unwanted. She wanted to hate him, to cast him out, to damn him for what he'd been. But part of her, some stubborn, traitorous part, saw the truth in his eyes. He had been there. He had failed to save John, but he hadn't been the hand that pulled the trigger. And yet, was that enough? Her voice trembled. Why come here? Why me? He swallowed hard. I didn't know at first. When I rode onto this land, I only wanted work, an honest day's labor to keep me breathing. But then I learned who you were. And every day since, I've been torn apart by it. I should have left, should have spared you this pain. But his voice faltered, low and unsteady. I couldn't. Clara. He didn't finish, but the words hung between them, thick and dangerous. Clara turned away, tears streaking her cheeks. Her heart was a battlefield, torn between grief and rage, between the memory of John and the living, breathing man who had saved her from fire, yet admitted to riding with his killers. The silence stretched, broken only by the creak of the porch boards beneath her shifting weight. Finally, she whispered, I don't know if I can forgive you. Calder bowed his head, his shoulders heavy with defeat. I wouldn't ask you to. I only ask you to, believe me. I didn't kill him, Clara. But I'll carry the guilt of that night until my last breath. For a long moment she stood there, trembling, her tears falling onto the worn wood. She didn't move toward him. She didn't send him away. She only stood between two worlds, the one she had lost and the one that now, against her will, pulled her closer to the man before her. And in the gathering dusk, as the prairie stretched, endless and unforgiving, Clara understood one thing with brutal clarity. Her life was no longer her own. Whatever came next, be it truth, blood, or ruin, Calder's past had bound itself to hers. The days that followed Calder's confession were heavy with silence. The prairie stretched wide as ever, the cattle moved through the pastures as they always had, but inside the ranch house, the air was taut, as though the walls themselves waited for Clara's verdict. She couldn't bear to look at him for long. Each time his shadow crossed her path, she felt her heart lurch, once with anger, then with a strange, aching pity. He worked harder than ever, rising before dawn, fixing what was broken, leaving food at her table without a word. If she passed him near the barn, his hat dipped, his eyes averted as though he knew he was no longer welcome in the light of her gaze. And yet, she did not send him away. She told herself it was because she needed him. The ranch was too large, the debts too pressing. She had no kin nearby, no hired hands who would stay with trouble brewing on the horizon. Without him, she and the ranch would both crumble. That was reason enough. But when she lay awake in the long dark hours, she knew it was not the whole truth. She remembered the fire, the feel of his arms carrying her through smoke. She remembered the way his voice had broken when he swore he hadn't killed John. She remembered the anguish in his eyes. Not the hard, cold eyes of an outlaw, but the weary gaze of a man broken by his own past. And still you let him stay, she told herself bitterly. Even knowing who he is, even knowing what he's done. By the fourth night, the silence between them cracked. She found him sitting by the corral fence beneath the moonlight, sharpening a blade with slow, steady strokes. His shoulders slumped forward, weary but alert, like a man who knew danger could ride in at any moment. "Why are you still here?" she asked quietly, surprising even herself with the words. He looked up, startled, as though he hadn't heard her approach. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then he said, "Because leaving won't change what happened, but maybe staying will." Her throat tightened. She wanted to ask what he meant, but some part of her already knew. He meant the McGraw gang. He meant John. He meant the ghosts that would not rest until this story was finished. The next morning proved him right. At dawn, hoofbeats thundered across the plains. Clara was already on the porch, rifle in hand, when the riders appeared. 4 this time, their faces hard, eyes glittering with malice. The same men who had come before, with another added to their number. "Morning, widow," the leader called, reining his horse at the gate. His grin was sharp, wolfish. "We've come for a little reunion, isn't that right, Calder?" Clara felt Calder stiffen beside her. He had stepped onto the porch without her noticing, his body coiled, his hand brushing the butt of his revolver. The second rider spat into the dirt. You've had your fun playing rancher, but McGraw wants you back where you belong, and he don't take kindly to deserters. Clara's grip tightened on her rifle. Her voice came steady, though her insides trembled. This is my land, you've no right here. The men laughed, a harsh chorus. Your land? Widow, you're sitting on borrowed time. Once McGraw has his way, there won't be a stick left standing on this place. The third rider leaned forward, eyes glinting. Unless, of course, you hand Calder over. Give us the traitor and maybe we'll leave you be. Clara's pulse pounded in her ears. They were offering her a way out, a chance to save her land, her life, everything, if she just gave him up. The man who had ridden with her husband's killers. The man who had lied by omission. The man who might yet destroy her. She turned, her eyes to Calder. He stood still, his jaw set, his gaze fixed on the riders. But when he felt her watching, he looked at her, truly looked, and in that fleeting moment, she saw the truth. He would not beg. He would not run. If she handed him over, he would accept it. Her voice shook as she said, "No, he stays." The leader's grin faded. The air grew sharp, the kind that precedes lightning. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, the rider tipped his hat low over his eyes. "Suit yourself," he muttered. "But don't say we didn't warn you." They wheeled their horses and rode off in a cloud of dust, their laughter trailing on the wind. Clara lowered her rifle with shaking hands. Calder exhaled slowly, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the men had vanished. "They'll be back," he said quietly. "And next time, it won't be words." Clara nodded, her heart heavy. She had made her choice. For better or worse, she had bound herself to him, and the storm was coming. The prairie had always carried a hush before dawn, but that morning the silence was wrong, thick and watchful, as though the earth itself held its breath. Clara rose from her bed before the Yule. Rooster crowed, restless, her mind circling like a hawk caught in its own shadow. The night's decision still burned in her. She had chosen to keep Calder, chosen to stand beside him instead of casting him to the wolves. But the wolves would come all the same. By mid-morning, Calder had stacked rifles and boxes of shells in the kitchen, laid spare revolvers on the table. The shutters were barred, the livestock penned close to the barn. He moved with the cool focus of a man who had prepared for this his entire life. Clara watched him quietly, her stomach a knot, her hands restless. "You don't have to fight," she whispered, though her voice trembled with the weight of the lie. His eyes lifted to hers, steady. "If I don't fight, they'll take everything, not just the ranch, you." Her throat tightened, but she said nothing. That afternoon, black smoke smudged the horizon. Calder spotted it first. Riders driving fire through the tall grass, sweeping it toward the ranch with the wind at their backs. A line of flame rose like a wall across the plain, orange tongues snapping at the sky. The McGraw gang was coming not just with bullets, but with ruin. Clara's heart lurched. "The cattle, they're gone if we don't stop them," Calder said grimly. He thrust a rifle into her hands. "Stay low. Keep to cover. You see a man, aim for me. You put him down. Don't think. Just fire." Her fingers shook around. The weapon. But she nodded. She had lost one man to that gang. She would not lose another without a fight. The riders came with the fire at their backs, 5 of them now, faces painted with soot, eyes gleaming like predators. Gunfire cracked. Across the yard, splinters flying from the porch rail. Calder returned fire, sharp and sure, the sound of his rifle steady in the chaos. Clara crouched by the window, her heart pounding so loud it nearly drowned the thunder of hooves. One rider broke for the barn, torch in hand. She raised her rifle, sighted down the barrel and pulled the trigger. The recoil slammed her shoulder, the man pitched from his saddle, and the torch rolled harmlessly into the dirt. Her breath came sharp and fast. She had never killed a man before. She did not look, to see if he stirred. She only chambered another round. Calder moved like a storm, shouting orders, firing with precision, dragging her behind cover when the bullets grew too thick. But there were too many, and the fire pressed closer, heat licking the edge of the yard, the wind driving sparks toward the wooden house. A voice bellowed above the din. "Calder, you traitor son of a, come face us proper." Clara's blood chilled. McGraw himself. The outlaw rode forward, broad-shouldered and mean-eyed, a revolver in each hand. His men closed in behind him, circling the house like vultures. Calder stepped into the open, rifle raised, and Clara's breath caught in her chest. "Stay back," she cried. But he only glanced at her, something fierce and final in his eyes. "This ends tonight." McGraw reined in, sneering. "Thought you could run, Calder? Thought you could play farmer, hide behind some widow's skirts? You belong to me." "I belong to no one," Calder shouted back, his voice raw. The two men fired almost as one. McGraw's bullet tore past Calder's arm, grazing flesh. Calder's shot struck McGraw's horse, sending it rearing. The outlaw tumbled into the dirt, cursing, rolling to his feet with pistols blazing. Clara screamed as Calder staggered, a crimson bloom spreading at his side. Fury burned through her fear. She leaned from the window, took careful aim at McGraw, and fired. The bullet missed his heart but struck his shoulder, spinning him sideways with a howl. Calder seized the moment, lunging forward despite the blood soaking his shirt. He wrestled McGraw into the dirt, fists flying, guns scattering into the dust. They grappled like wild beasts, the roar of fire and gunfire around them. Clara wanted to run to him, to drag him back, but another rider charged toward the porch. She fired again, dropping him before he could raise his weapon. Smoke stung her eyes, the world a haze of flame and gunpowder. At last, Calder's fist cracked against McGraw's jaw with a sickening thud. The outlaw slumped, dazed, his hand scrabbling, blindly for the revolver nearby. Clara saw it first. She darted from the porch, skirt singed, rifle clutched tight. She planted her boot on the gun, leveled her barrel at McGraw's head. "Move again," she hissed, voice shaking, "and I'll finish it." For the first time, fear flickered in McGraw's eyes. The other riders, seeing their leader down and two of their men dead, faltered. Another shot from Calder dropped one, and the rest broke, spurring their horses back through the smoke, leaving their wounded behind. Silence followed, broken only by the crackle of flames and Clara's ragged breathing. Calder sagged to one knee, clutching his side. She dropped beside him, throwing an arm around his shoulders. "Stay with me. Oh God, stay with me." He smiled faintly through the blood. "You shoot straighter than most men I've known." Tears burned her eyes as she pressed her hand against his wound. Around them the ranch still smoldered, the prairie blackened, but the house still stood. The cattle were spooked, but alive, and McGraw lay groaning in the dirt, defeated. Clara held Calder close, her heart breaking and mending all at once. Whatever tomorrow brought, lawmen, neighbors, the weight of choices yet to come, they had faced the fire together. And in the crucible of that night, something stronger than fear, stronger than grief, had taken root between them. Morning broke pale and hollow after the storm of fire and gunpowder. The prairie lay scarred, the grass blackened for miles. Smoke, curling upward in thin, mournful ribbons. The ranch still stood, though the paint was scorched and the porch beams charred at their edges. Cattle wandered skittishly in the paddock, stamping nervously at the smell of ash. Clara stood at the porch rail, shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her hands trembling though the air was warm. Behind her, Calder lay on the sofa inside, his breathing, shallow but steady. She had cleaned the wound as best she could, bandaged it tight, prayed over him in whispers until her throat went dry. He had survived the night. That was something. That was everything. Her gaze swept the horizon. No riders appeared. No fresh smoke rose. The McGraw gang had fled like shadows before the dawn, leaving their wounded leader tied to a post in her yard, too broken to run. His groans had faded with the hours, until only silence remained. By the time the sun reached its peak, McGraw was still. Clara covered his body with a tarp and left him where the law would find him. The law would come. Word of the fight would spread. Neighbors would talk of the widow who harbored a wanted man, of blood spilled on her land. She would have to answer questions. So would Calder. Inside, she found him awake, his eyes heavy-lidded but clear. He looked at her as though he had been waiting all his life for that moment. For her, standing there in the hush after violence, her face pale with exhaustion, her eyes still shining with stubborn fire. "You should have let them take me," he whispered. His voice was a rasp, but his gaze was steady. "Would have spared you all this." She knelt beside him, her hand brushing the sweat-damp hair from his brow. "If I'd let them take you, I'd be no better than the grave they put John in. You saved me. You saved this place. I won't pretend otherwise." His jaw tightened, a shadow crossing his face. "I didn't save your husband. I can't change what I rode with, the men I called brothers once." Clara's throat constricted. The name, John, still carried weight like stone. For so long, her heart had been a battlefield, torn between grief for the man she lost and the pull of the one before her. Yet the truth had been seared into her, by fire. Grief did not erase love, but neither did it forbid it from blooming again. "You can't change the past," she said softly. "But you've changed what you are. I've seen it, and I won't let the past steal everything from me." For a long time, neither spoke. Only the soft creak of the house, the distant low of cattle, the whisper of wind through the blackened fields filled the air. Then Calder reached for her hand. His was rough, calloused, trembling with weakness, but it closed around hers like an anchor. "If the law comes for me," he said quietly, "don't fight them. Let me go. Promise me that." Her eyes stung with tears, but she shook her head. "No promises, not when I've only just begun to find you." The lawmen arrived 2 days later. They came in dust-stained coats, hats low, their eyes sharp with suspicion as they surveyed the blackened land and the bodies buried beyond the barn. Questions rained down like hammers. Clara stood firm. She told them the truth, of the gang who came to burn her out, of the fight for her land, of Calder's part in saving it. She did not speak of the man he once was. The sheriff looked long at Calder, lying pale on the sofa, then at the widow standing beside him with fire still burning in her eyes. At last he gave a slow nod. "Sometimes the law has bigger snakes to kill," he said, and left McGraw's body in chains to tell the tale. When the riders vanished down the road, Clara sagged against the doorframe, relief flooding her. Calder reached for her hand again, his lips curved in the faintest of smiles. "You fought harder than I ever could have," he murmured. She bent down, pressing her forehead to his. "We fought together. The weeks that followed were hard. The land was scarred, the debt still heavy, the future uncertain." Calder healed slowly, each day gaining strength. Sometimes he walked the fence line with her at dusk, his hand brushing hers, silence stretching easy between them. Sometimes he still woke in the night, haunted by ghosts only he could see. But the ranch stood, and so did they. One evening, as the sun bled red over the prairie, Calder stopped her by the corral. His voice was low, almost shy. "I can't promise you safety. I can't promise you riches. All I can give you is this, my hands, my heart, whatever years I've got left. If that ain't enough, I'll go." Clara looked at him. The man who had been both stranger and savior, outlaw and protector. The man she had nearly lost to fire and blood. Slowly she took his hand and placed it against her heart. "It's enough," she whispered. "It's more than enough." The wind stirred through the blackened fields, carrying with it the faintest hint of green where new shoots pushed bravely through the ash. Dawn had come to the prairie, and with it, the promise of life reborn. And though the road ahead was uncertain, Clara knew one thing with a clarity that outshone the rest. She would not walk it alone.